بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ومن الفاتحة على أسلافنا الصالحين وبأن الله يفتح علينا فتوح العارفين ويفقهنا في الدين وأن الله يهدي قلوبنا إلى الحق. هذه النية ولكل نية صالحة وإلى حضرة النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. بسم الله سورة الفاتحة. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم. Alhamdulillah, I'm happy to see some familiar faces from our last session wherein we compared between Ghazali and Descartes. And of course, tonight we will be dealing with very influential figures from the Islamic and Western tradition who are not too far from our time, who still exercise an influence way down to our times. As per the previous time, the tradition that we have now established, what I will try to do is to divide this talk into two sessions, shall we say. The first half, in this case, beginning with Nietzsche, and the last time we began with Al-Ghazali because Al-Ghazali came first before Descartes. So this time we will begin with Nietzsche and then gradually move on to Iqbal. I will certainly not be able to summarize the entire system or the entire thought of these two very great thinkers, but at the very least I want to focus on the notion of man within these great thinkers. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who is well known for some of his works such as Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, The Genealogy of Morals, flourished in the 19th century. He was born in 1844, and he, because of his exceptional talent in philology, by the time he was 24 or 25, he was already elected a professor extraordinarius for his singular ability and his singular promise in his potential. Of course, his first work at that time, due to the influence of the great German musician Wagner, was to publish a work called On the Birth of Tragedy. Yes. In this work, in the Birth of Tragedy, he outlined two different spirits of the Greeks, yes, that join together, that form what we call the Greek spirit. One is the Apollonian rationalistic spirit, meaning to say that creates order, and then there is the Dionysian crave for chaos and power, that somehow when they beautifully combine, they form this tragic spirit of the Greeks. However, of course, he was saying that Greek philosophy in his later works contracted the sickness of Plato later, contracted the sickness of Socrates later, and especially removed the Greek spirit from the Dionysian element of freedom, or the Dionysian element of energy. I will try to mention three, I think, major ideas of Nietzsche and how they converge on our conception, or on his and the Western conception of man. In the 19th century, we know that perhaps the most influential philosopher in the continent of Europe was Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy was to effect Western philosophy and Western theology so greatly, in that they began to, at least as a metaphysical proposition, no longer take God seriously, no longer take the afterlife seriously, and no longer take morality seriously as a matter of theoretical underpinning. Kant still affirm for practical purposes the importance of these concepts, but in terms of their metaphysical status, whether or not they truly exist, the mind has no recourse to these things. So gradually what had happened in Western ideas, Christianity, yes, the main representative of theism in the West, in Europe at that time, is now gradually losing its ability to control the minds of the general population, especially its intelligentsia. So gradually what had happened, in one of his works, he announced the death of God. He said that the Europeans, we have killed him. And what is meant by that is that now no longer does God exercise the all-important role as being the source of the standard of ethical judgments in Europe. So he said that what then must we do in order to be deserving of this deed? He said we should become the source of ethical guidance ourselves. Yes. So we wanted to select several key ideas of the thought of Nietzsche. One is the transvaluation of all values. Yes, the transvaluation of all values. Because he was saying that since the values of Christianity no longer stands on firm metaphysical basis, since all the values now have no real objective basis, so human beings should aspire to create the values themselves. So every value should be transvaluated and see for what they produce. And that's his grand project of looking at the genealogy of morals. He started studying moralities, and he then divided moralities into two types, what he called the master morality and the slave morality. The master morality is the kind of morality that produces, or that celebrates strength, that celebrates creative output, that celebrates foolhardiness even, that celebrates the development of one's abilities. It is the virtue of the nobility and of the aristocrats. Yes, the desire for conquest, the desire for wealth, yes, greed, and so on. Then there is the slave morality, the morality of the masses, the herd, those who are in themselves found wanting of talent. They are mediocre for all intents and purposes. As a result, they promote a life ideal of, say, redistribution of wealth, of pity, for example. Desiring equality and so on, because they couldn't fend for themselves, so therefore they promoted this meekness. So he was saying therefore that the grand styles of the previous ethical systems, be it Christianity or other forms, all tended towards these things. Yes, meaning to say they either represented the master morality or the slave morality. So therefore, what he wants to do is to press the reset button for that time. Yes, to transvalue all values and now to re-evaluate anew. What should be the morality that guides you, that promotes the most excellent degree of flourishing for the individual? Secondly is his doctrine of the Superman, which is interrelated with the first, of course. Because he was saying that partially because of the dominant conception of evolution that was trending at that time, he was saying that man stands in between the brute animals and the Superman. So human beings stand in between the two, and the purpose of ethics ought to be to declare the coming of the Superman, the Overman, meaning to say the person who transcends the limitations of good and evil. And he thus studies for example, as part of his genealogy program, he saw, for example, that some ethical systems are corrupt because it doesn't celebrate the wants and the needs of the body and promote, for example, the ascetic ideal, which is contrary to the development of the self, at least according to his understanding. And then finally, in metaphysics, although I don't know how seriously he might have thought about this, or it's just whether or not he believed that because of the power of the idea or truly on the strength of the argument, he espoused the notion of the eternal recurrence. So this eternal recurrence, accordingly, for him, time is cyclical. Everything that has happened now would have happened at some cycle of history. Everything in history repeats itself. Every single data repeats itself, given an infinite amount of time backwards and forwards. So time is cyclical like that. So therefore he was saying that the kind of life that we should live is the kind of life that we would affirm that is satisfactory for us to live. So these are, shall we say, the three perhaps key and fundamental ideas. He has, in order to drive the idea to us in a more poetic fashion, he uses the symbol of the three metamorphoses. Yes? The three metamorphoses, which is found in Das books, Zarathustra. He mentions that man begins as spirit. Meaning to say, as spirit, in the first place, we are the weak I, the slender I. This weak I is determined and controlled by social values and social currents. So whatever that your society has decided is your value becomes your value. You are not the decider of what you want to pursue. You become, for example, you stand at the mercy of whatever society and whatever dominant morality happens to be the case. So he was saying that in order for the Superman to be able to emerge, you need to undergo three forms, or three metamorphoses, three formal change. The first metamorphosis is to metamorphose into a camel. The camel is a symbol of load-bearing strength. Meaning to say, if you want to change, first, you have to be able to bear the load of changing. You have to be willing to struggle. You have to be willing to work harder than you thought that you could. Because the camel kneels and is able to handle a lot of pressure. The camel, however, still works within the ethical structure of the community, except that the camel who strives harder than the rest becomes successful within the conceptual structures of the community, the ethical structures of the community. He said the camel will be able to escape that initial prison if he were to change into a lion, the second level of the metamorphosis. The lion is the one who not only can bear the weight, but he's the king of the animals, in that he is able to, as he roams the desert, he would encounter the thou shalt nots and the thou shalts. Yes, these are very powerful imperatives. Yes, society and cultures and group and individuals and communities are driven by the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. All society will foster the notion of this, things that you must do and things that you must never do, as part and parcel of the survival of the community, the survival of the subgroup, and these ethical drives are unquestionable. It tantamounts to sacredness. So you have to be willing to deconsecrate the idea, and deconsecrating is a very powerful action, because you have to be willing to suffer the consequences of challenging the dominant ideas of society. That's the lion. However, despite the courage of the lion and having no fear of the consequences and being able to constantly challenge the ideas of mediocrity and so on, the lion will tire itself if it defines itself, if the person defines himself, herself, in opposition to the general ideas of the community, however unthinking the idea may be. That's when, as the philosopher enters into a more mature stage, he enters into his third form, the form of the child. Yes. The child is now not defined in opposition to the world. The child lives a pre-ethical notion of the world. He's willing to experiment. The child is creative. The child is able to look at the world as a means of expressing power over it. The child has the will to power, meaning to say tries to control its external environment. And the child, of course, is a prefiguring until the final form of man were to emerge, which is the Superman, the Overman, the one that exceeds the expectations. You can see, you can ask the sort of things that perhaps if we are not accustomed to challenging these things or to question these things, you will say, why should one question your ideals? Why should a person question ethics? Why should you bother with these things? But you must know that for Nietzsche, what he was up against isn't just the community or the society. That wasn't the ghost that he was trying to exorcise. That wasn't the demon that he was up against. yes, he may have blamed it on Christianity and so on. This was because not purposely attacking Christianity per se, but he was considering the consequences of nihilism. Yes, that's the real enemy. Yes, nihilism or meaninglessness. That's the real struggle that he was struggling against. Because he knew that if you were to destroy any metaphysical foundation to your ethics, there's nothing left there. Nature left disenchanted, becomes a collection of, say, matter. Man loses meaning. Man is now no longer interrelated to the universe that he's part and parcel of. So meaninglessness was a serious threat and a serious danger to the poetic soul of Nietzsche. And he revolts against that. Because if you were not fighting against nihilism, if you allow nihilism to control your life, then you would suffer great depression. You would suffer lack of motivation in life. You would suffer lack of any cause of happiness. You would begin to question even why should you leave your bed in the day? Because the motivations that used to motivate you in your youth, for example, wealth, power and so on, gradually these things lose meaning if in the overall scheme there is no meaning. So that's why, in order to counteract nihilism, yes, he designs this sort of Sisyphean sort of project in which he tries to find what is the greatest sort of enemy that he can. So in a sense, he was still at the lion stage. He hasn't really exceeded it until he becomes a child. Because he wanted to see himself as, he wrote one of the books in which he declares himself the Antichrist. Because he wanted to go the real extreme. Because he wanted to go beyond good and evil. But after a while, you see, during his time, those things might appear scandalous. But 50 years later, there are no news anymore, no substance anymore. Yes. The 20th century, after Nietzsche, that kind of burning desire becomes extinguished. Yes. And now, 100 over years later, what are we left? What great system can we confront? Yes, if we have not reduced ourselves to meaninglessness. Yes. So that, you can appreciate him for his heroism. Iqbal himself, he arrived in Europe 5 years after the death of Nietzsche, and by then Nietzsche had already become very popular in the German scene. Iqbal said of Nietzsche that this Majdub, this infatuated man of Europe, he said, were he to meet with Iqbal, I would teach him the secret of the one. Yes. And then in another work, Iqbal wrote the Javid Nama, yes, the secrets of the pilgrimage, in which he in a creative manner explains his meeting with the great minds from the Persian speaking world, from the Islamic intellectual tradition, and including Nietzsche himself. He was saying that when he met with Nietzsche, he knew that this man, he has the heart of a believer but the mind of a kafir. Yes. He desperately wanted to believe, but there was nothing that was given to him. So as a result, he revolted against everything. His hand was crimson with the death of Christianity. He killed it because it wasn't there to satisfy him. However, Iqbal said, if only that type of spirit lived during the days of Ahmad Asir Hindi, he would have surely been guided and he would have achieved greatness. That's Iqbal. And I think this is a good means, a seamless introduction into Iqbal. Iqbal, on the other hand, was born in what was then British India, which is now part of Pakistan, which he helped foster and create. Yes. Iqbal, of course, was fortunate to have gained from the intellectual tradition of Islam. He had written his doctoral study in the development of metaphysics in Persia. And in that work, he recounts the development of Islamic thought as even from the Zoroastrian, the Zen period in Persia, in the Persian-speaking world, and to the thoughts of Ash'ari, Imam al-Ghazali, until gradually he reached to the metaphysical Sufis, including in his study Abdul Karim al-Jili and the early Sufis. what is to be remarked in the development of the metaphysics in Persia that would characterize Iqbal's notion of man is that already by then he was saying of tasawwuf, that tasawwuf or Sufism understood reality as a will, as an ego, as a being, as a person in that sense. And then of course, that was early tasawwuf. But in the later periods, especially due to the introduction of the Ishraqi modes of thinking, they introduced new metaphors such as reality as light, reality as this notion of wahdatul wujud and so on. Nevertheless, the mature ideas of Iqbal and his thought would be found in his poetry, yes, including of course the Asrar al-Khudi, the secrets of the self, as we mentioned just now, Jabit Nama, and his lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam. Iqbal engaged Nietzsche directly in his writings because he saw, especially in the lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, he had a specific chapter devoted to the notion of man. We can see that already starting from the standpoint of the worldview of Islam, starting from the standpoint of the Quran, he was given something that the Europeans were not given. First, in the Quran are attributes and characteristics of God which highlight the greatness and supremacy of the one true creator. He highlights in a note about Nietzsche that the last verses of Surah Al-Hashr, yes, Huwallahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, is the Lord in which there is no God other than He, Alimul Ghaibi wa Shahada, knowing the unseen and knowing the realm, the visible realms. He is the Malik, He is the King and the owner and the possessor, Al-Quddus, As-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Aziz, Al-Jabbar, Al-Mutakabbir. With this notion already there, therefore, that the religious thought of Islam centers itself upon such a great being, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with these characteristic attributes that inspires man. And he quotes a hadith that the Sufis are fond of quoting, تَخَلَّقُ بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, that you are to act, you are to develop within yourself the characteristic attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it became also the foundation of Imam Al-Ghazali's Maqsad Al-Asna fi Sharah Asma'illahi Al-Husna, in which Imam Al-Ghazali commented upon the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and explained how in the 99 names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what aspect that a human being can develop of that name. So already, therefore, the ethics of Islam is not a self-negating ethics. The ethics of Islam is not a self-destroying ethics, a self-denying ethics. It is a self-building ethics. And then furthermore, the notion of man in the Quran is of a great being. Already the first man was designed to be God's vicegerent on earth. And his characteristic attribute was knowledge. And he was placed above the angels, because the angels were made to worship him, and he is God's vicegerent. Already that is a sign of a great morality. It's not a servant morality per se. And then furthermore, not only is man given this khilafah, man is also given the trust of responsibility and freedom. Because there is also mentioned in another verse, indeed that Allah has entrusted unto the heavens and the mountains a trust. But they rejected it, yes. But man took on this trust. Innahu kana zaluman jahula. Indeed, man was so unjust to himself, and he was ever so ignorant. So Iqbal was saying that in the foundations of these Quranic verses is already found that the human individual is of a certain high stature. He, of course, in the lectures of the reconstruction in the reconstruction, mentions how what was then contemporary science and contemporary philosophy can be used to support some of the conclusions of Islamic tradition. He was critical of the mutakallimun, he was saying that the theologians, the mutakallimun, sacrifice this great understanding of man by substituting or by buying into the Greek notion of defining man as one substance, a finer substance. So therefore it sacrifices man's ego. And the theological development, according to him, at least the ones that were Hellenistically inspired, tended to rob away from man the spirit of progress, or the spirit of development, or the spirit of improvement. Of course, I think, to be fair to the mutakallimun, this characteristic is not really true of all the writings of the Ahlul Kalam. You find in At-Taftazani, who commented upon An-Nasafi, he mentions in the last words of in the, shall we say, concluding words of the Aqaid An-Nasafi, that man, or rather the mu'min, the believers among mankind, are superior to the generality of the angels, and the prophets among mankind is superior to the prophets amongst the angels. So that negates the claim, the thesis by Iqbal that the Ahlul Kalam tended to reduce man to a discussion of atoms and accidents. Although that was part of it, but that wasn't the totality of the teachings of the Mutakallimun. And then furthermore, Iqbal blamed the Sufis for promoting this notion of self-negation, promoting the poverty of the Muslims, of making the Muslims backward by accepting whatever that was given unto them and not developing their external world. So therefore, Iqbal thought that he needed to replace, the notion of the nafs, which is filled with negative connotations, with another notion with another word that he thought was colorless, but can describe the human self in a positive manner. And that's how he used the Persian word khudi, which is, according to him, despite being in use in Persian, is relatively colorless in that it can be utilized by him to in his poetry in order to highlight a new vision for mankind, a new vision for the human individual, if you desire progress and perfection. And in response to Nietzsche's three metamorphoses, Iqbal also talks about the three rules of development. He's saying that in the beginning, in order for transformation to take place, you have to follow the Sharia. Yes. The first stage is the stage of following the Sharia. This stage of following the Sharia is not easy, because you have to go through, the Bunya al-Islamu ala khamsin. You have to go through the five forms of ibadah in order to fight your evil aspect, to fight your nafs, your negative aspects. The salah is something that you have to consistently do, because it will create awareness and consciousness of the ultimate ego, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Lord. The zakat is meant to cure yourself of the malady of greed. And fasting is meant to give you strength to curtail and to control the powers of your negative desires. And then Hajj is the overall remedy, because it combines together several forms of ibadah, such that if done properly, done effectively, then you come back a changed person. So that's the stage of rule following. He said that after regulating yourself, or after forcing yourself to follow the rules, after a while, then you may ascend to the second stage, which is the stage of self-governance. Now this is the time when you turn increasingly inward, and you start to realize that you want to that these have now become part of your tabi'ah. This has become part of your regular states of action. Now you are able to change yourself and able to change society, until gradually you prepare for the highest stage, which is the stage of vice-regency or vicegerency, in which you have now been inwardly transformed, so as to follow the character and attributes of God insofar as you can. Meaning, you become the creative initiators in order to change your society. Now let's look at the differences between Iqbal and Nietzsche in terms of their background. Nietzsche was lamenting the problem of meaninglessness which he saw. Europe was entering into a stage of loss of foundations, loss of anchoring, loss of mooring. There was nothing to stand by. They stand at the precipice of nihilism. So that's why he promoted this notion of the Superman. Iqbal, on the other hand, lived through to see the Muslims being backward and being enemies of progress, being people who were comfortable with their poverty and ignorance. And he blamed, of course, to a large extent, some of them, the Sufis, at least. I mean, these were the Sufis who have corrupted the original meaning of Tasawwuf. He does distinguish between these regular types and the higher Sufis, the metaphysical Sufis, the early Sufis, who did work on themselves in order to change society. What he had tried to do, of course, was to engineer and to change the state of the society based on his belief that God doesn't change. Yes, inna Allah la yughayyiru biqawmin. God doesn't change the community until they change that which is within themselves. So he wanted to reconstruct religious thought so that now religious thought doesn't serve. So he is something similar to Nietzsche in that he knew that when society is failing, when society suffers ethical regress, when society is not moving in the right direction, there needs to be a fundamental change of ethical thinking. There needs to be a fundamental change about motivation, about good and bad, about good and evil, about progress and so on, about values, about worldview ultimately. So that's why he worked on this reconstruction. So his reconstruction is based also not only on his understanding about the individual, in which of course he uses what was available to him in Western thought and Islamic thought, the best of both worlds. But more importantly, Iqbal also had a certain vision of history. He tried to, partly because of morale, and this a lot of his contemporaries were doing the same too. They were saying that, in fact, Western modernity only became a possibility as a result of interaction with Islam. He especially highlighted the role of Sicily and Spain in fostering the spirit of the Enlightenment. Before that, the medieval age, and then gradually the rise of modernity. He was saying that it was Islam that introduced the birth of the inductive intellect, whereas the Greeks were so fond of the rational deductive abilities of mathematics. That wasn't the key to scientific progress. Empirical progress required inductive research, meaning to say, research into the particulars of things in order that you can change the external world. So he was saying therefore that that spirit, that scientific and technological spirit, is in reality borrowed and used to galvanize the engine of modern progress. So the Muslims must reacquire and repossess these things so as to be part of the engine of progress. Except that, whereas the West, having modernized, having progress, they also suffered their chief problems of materialism and the chief problems of atheism. And Iqbal was especially critical of the social philosophy in the West, especially Marxism and Hegelianism, the notion of this, the notion of the dialectics of history, or the dialectics of economic means of production that removes individual creativity and leaves it to the law of history to produce the sort of desired outcome. Or even the way Nietzsche was also critical of utilitarianism, that promoted this kind of living that desires merely pleasure and the removal of pain. So therefore he needed the individuals of the Muslim world to paint a better outcome and a better future for themselves. Is this spirit utterly Islamic? Well, according to Fazlur Rahman, the one who's perhaps amongst the later scholars who's most appreciative of Iqbal, he was saying that although the Islamic elements in Iqbal's thought was well pronounced. I mean, that he had true insights into the nature of tasawwuf and Islamic thought. A large aspect of his ideas, especially the ones in which he borrowed what was current in European modernity, truly were not congenial to Islam. That couldn't really be, and this is what also Prof. Al-Attas mentioned in the commentary on the Hujjah to Siddiq in his epilogue. He was saying that some of his ideas, especially the notion of evolutionism and the notion of the Elan Vital as part of Henry Bergson's idea of this constant progress, some of these things, they are not ideas that are probably congenial to Islam. And furthermore, despite owing a lot to the metaphysicians, the Sufis, Iqbal was not willing to acknowledge properly what he owed to them. And he was also, in a sense, unfair with the Sufis. Because, for example, in contradistinction to Professor Iqbal Al-Attas, who had, in his, one of the chapters of the Prolegomena, Prof. Al-Attas mentioned in the chapter on the intuition of existence, that there are in fact stages that the Sufis undergo. Only in the beginning, he said the stage was of fana, meaning to say extinction in the consciousness of God without pantheism and monism and all these other deviant ideas. And denial of the existence of the world happens at this stage. But at the higher stage, the Sufis of the second, they call it the Farqu Thani, the second separation, the return to the self after that great experience, they reaffirm the existence of the world as wujud idafi, as borrowed existence from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they continue to work on developing themselves and developing the community. So it is not true that the Islamic spirit fosters this sort of becoming a fossil and becoming a dead body, yes, and to be otherworldly alone, because the ultimate model for the Islamic tradition is the Prophet. And truly, if you affirm that perfection was achieved in the lifetime of the Prophet and his was the true model, then evolutionism must be rejected, because evolutionism believes that there is some sort of far future in which the perfect stage would occur or not. In anyways, Prophet Al-Attas was saying that in reality what was required of Islamic thought wasn't a reconstruction, because a reconstruction would involve Islamic thought in a very tricky situation whereby you put in elements which are not congenial to it, that only compounds the confusion and error in knowledge. What is required is a restatement. A restatement, meaning to say, judging from the great works of the Islamic intellectual tradition, the great achievements of the Muslims in the past, you restate it with regards to what has been lost of the understanding that was achieved by the Muslims in the past. Yes, meaning to say, you have to look at the great thinkers, you have to look at the likes of Imam Al-Ghazali, Fakhruddin Ar-Razi, and all these great thinkers in this part of the world, Ar-Raniri and Fansuri. When you look at what they have achieved, then you see what is it that is missing in our times now that makes us the opposite of these great Muslims in the past. So then, that being said, of course, in his poetic spirit and his poetic ability, of course, Iqbal, he challenged his readers to work on themselves, yes, to challenge themselves to ever improve their ethical states. And with that, I think therein lies my summary of the conception of man in these two thinkers. I'm glad if we can have some discussion tonight, and some questions and answers are also welcome, certainly.